Welcome to Stories with Liz, Gothic time again. This time by the author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, and his short story called The Narrative of the Ghost of a Hand. It was first released in 1863. I am sure she believed every word she related, for old Sally was ferocious. But all this was worth just so much as such talk commonly is. Marvels, fable, what our ancestors called winter's tales, which gathered details from every narrator and dilated in the act of narration. Still, it was not quite for nothing that the house was held to be haunted. Under all this smoke, there smoldered just a little spark of truth, an authenticated mystery, for the solution of which some of my readers may possibly suggest a theory, though I confess I cannot. Miss Rebecca Chatsworth, in a letter dated late in the autumn of 1753, gives a minute and curious relation of occurrences in the Tilde house, which, it is plain, although at starting she protested against all such fooleries, she has heard with a particular sort of interest, and relates it certainly with an awful sort of particularity. The annoyances described did not begin till the end of August, when one evening Mrs. Prosser, quite alone, was sitting in the twilight at the back parlor window, which was open, looking out into the orchard, and plainly saw a stealthily placed hand resting upon the window-sill, as if by someone beneath the window at her right side, intended to climb up. There was nothing but the hand, which was rather short but handsomely formed and white and plump, laid on the edge of the window-sill, and it was not a very young hand, but one aged somewhere about 40, as she conjectured. It was only a few weeks before that the horrible robbery at Clondalkin had taken place, and the lady fancied that the hand was that of one of the miscreants who was now about to scale the window of the Tilde house. She uttered a loud scream and an ejaculation of terror, and at the same moment the hand was quietly withdrawn. Search was made in the orchard, but no indications of any persons having been under the window, beneath which, ranged along the wall, stood a great column of flower pots, which it seemed must have prevented anyone's coming within reach of it. The same night there came a hasty tapping, every now and then, at the window in the kitchen. The women grew frightened, and the servant man, taking firearms with them, opened the back door, but discovered nothing. As he shut it, however, he said, a thump came on it, and a pressure as if somebody striving to force its way in, which frightened him. And though the tapping went on upon the kitchen window panes, he made no further explorations. About 6 o'clock on the Sunday evening following, the cook, an honest, sober woman, now aged 60 years, being alone in the kitchen, saw, on looking up, it is supposed, the same fat but aristocratic-looking hand laid with its palm against the glass, near the side of the window, and this time moving slowly up and down, pressed all the while against the glass, as if feeling carefully for some inequality in its surface. She cried out and said something like a prayer on seeing it, but it was not withdrawn for several seconds later. After this, for a great many nights, there came first a low, and afterwards an angry rapping, as it seemed with a set of clenched knuckles at the back door, and the servant man would not open it, but called to know who was there, and there came no answer, only a sound as if the palm of the hand was placed against it and drawn slowly from side to side, with a sort of soft groping motion. All this time sitting in the back parlor, which for the time being they used as a drawing room, Mr. and Mrs. Prosser were disturbed by the rappings at the windows, sometimes very low and furtive, like a clandestine signal, and at others, sudden and so loud, as to threaten the breaking of the pane. This was all at the back of the house, which looked upon the orchard, as you know, but on Tuesday night, at about 9:30, there came precisely the same rapping at the hall door, and it went on, to the great annoyance of the master and the terror of his wife, at intervals for nearly 2 hours. After this, for several days and nights, they had no annoyance whatsoever, and began to think that the nuisance had expended itself. But on the night of the 13th of September, Jane Easterbrook, an English maid, having gone into the pantry for the small silver bowl in which her mistress' posset was served, happening to look up at the little window of only 4 panes, observed through the agar hole which was drilled through the window frame, for the admission of a bolt to secure the shutter, a white pudgy finger, first the tip and then 2 first joints, introduced and turned about thus way and that, crooked against the inside, as if in search of fastenings which its owner designed to push aside. When the maid got back into the kitchen, we are told, she fell into a swoon, and was all the next day very weak. Mr. Prosen being, I've heard, a hard-headed and conceited sort of fellow, scouted the ghost and sneered of the fears of his family. He was privately on the opinion of the whole affair was a practical joke or fraud, and waiting an opportunity of catching the rogue in flagrante delicto. He did not long keep his theory to himself, but let it out by degrees, with no stint of oaths and treats, believing that some domestic traitor held the thread of the conspiracy. Indeed, it was time something were done, for not only his servants, but good Mrs. Prosser herself, had grown to look unhappy and anxious. They kept at home from the hour of sunset, and would not venture about the house after nightfall, except in couples. The knocking had ceased for about a week, when one night, Mrs. Prosser being in the nursery, her husband, who was in the parlor, heard it begin very softly on the hall door. The air was quite still, which favored his hearing distinctly. It was the first time there had been any disturbance at that side of the house, and the character of the summons was changed. Mr. Prosser, leaving the parlor door open, it seems, went quietly into the hall. The sound was that of beating on the outside of the stout door, softly and regularly, with the flat of the hand. He was going to open it suddenly, but changed his mind, and went back very quietly and on to the head of the kitchen stair, where there was a strong closet over the pantry, in which he kept his firearms, swords, and canes. Here he called his manservant, whom he believed to be honest, and with a pair of loaded pistols in his own coat pocket, and giving another pair to him, he went as lightly as he could, followed by the man, and with a stout walking cane in his hand, forward to the door. Everything went as Mr. Prosser wished. The besieger of his house, so far from taking fright at their approach, grew more impatient, and the sort of panting which had aroused his attention at first assumed the rhythm and emphasis of a series of double knocks. Mr. Prosser angrily opened the door with his right arm across, cane in hand. Looking, he saw nothing, but his arm was jerked up oddly, as it might be with the hollow of a hand and something passing under it, with a kind of gentle squeeze. The servant neither saw nor felt anything, and did not know why his master looked back so hastily, cutting with his cane and shutting the door with a sudden slam. From that time Mr. Prosser discontinued his angry talk and swearing about it, and seemed nearly as averse from the subject as the rest of his family. He grew in fact very uncomfortable, feeling an inward persuasion that when, in answer to the summons, he had opened the hall door and had actually given admission to the besieger. He said nothing to Mrs. Prosser, but went up earlier to his bedroom, where he read a while in his Bible and said a prayer. I hope the particular relation of his circumstances does not indicate its singularity. He lay awake a good while, it appears, and, as he supposed, about 12:15, he heard the soft palm of a hand patting on the outside of the bedroom door, and then brushed slowly along it. Up bounced Mr. Prosser, very much frightened, and locked the door, crying, "Who's there?" but received no answer but the same brushing sound of a soft hand down over the panels, which he knew only too well. In the morning the housemaid was terrified by the impression of a hand in the dust of the little parlor table, where they had been unpacking delft and other things the day before. The print of the naked foot in the sea sand did not frighten Robinson Crusoe half as much as it frightened them. They were by this time all nervous, and some of them half crazed by the hand. Mr. Prosser went to examine the mark and made light of it, but, as he swore afterwards, rather to quiet his servants than from any uncomfortable feeling about it in his own mind, however, he had them all, one by one, into the room, and made each place his or her hand, palm downwards, on the table, thus taking a similar impression from every person in the house, including himself and his wife. And this affidavit deposed that the formation of the hand so impressed differed altogether from those of the living inhabitants of the house, and corresponded with the hand seen by Mrs. Prosser and the cook. Whoever or whatever the owner of the hand might be, they all felt with subtle demonstration to mean that it was declared he was no longer out of doors, but had established himself in the house. And now Mrs. Prosser began to be troubled with strange and horrible dreams, some of which, as set out in detail in Aunt Rebecca's long letter, are really very unappealing nightmares. But one night, as Mr. Prosser closed his bedchamber door, he was struck somewhat by the utter silence of the room, there being no sound of breathing, which seemed uncomfortable to him, as he knew his wife was in bed, and his ears were particularly sharp. There was a candle burning on a small table at the foot of the bed, besides the one he held in one hand, a heavy ledger connected with his father-in-law's business being under his arm. He drew the curtain at the side of the bed and saw Mrs. Prosser lying, for a few seconds he mortally feared dead, her face being motionless, white, and covered with cold dew, and on the pillow close beside her head and just within the curtains was, as he first thought, a toad, but really the same fattish hand, the wrist resting on the pillow, and the fingers extended towards her temple. Mr. Prosser, with a horrible jerk, pitched the ledger right at the curtains, behind which the owner of the hand might be supposed to stand. The hand was instantaneously and smoothly snatched away, the curtains made a great wave, and Mr. Prosser got round the bed in time to see the closet door, which was on the other side, pulled to by the same white, puffy hand, as he believed. He drew the door open with a fling and looked in. But the closet was empty, except for the clothes hanging from pegs on the walls, and the dressing table and looking-glass facing the windows. He shut it sharply and locked it, and felt for a minute, he said, as if he were like to lose his wits. Then, ringing at the bell, he brought the servants, and with much ado they recovered Mrs. Prosser from a sort of trance in which, he says, from her looks, she seemed to have suffered the pains of death. And Aunt Rebecca adds, from what she told me of her visions, with her own lips, he might have added, and of hell also. But the occurrence which seems to have determined the crisis was the strange sickness of their eldest child, a little boy aged between 2 and 3 years. He lay awake in terror, and the doctors who were called in set down the symptoms to incipient water on the brain. Mrs. Prosser used to sit up with the nurse by the nursery fire, much troubled in her mind about the condition of her child. His bed was placed sideways along the wall, with its head against the door of a press or cupboard, which, however, did not shut quite close. There was a little valance, about a foot deep, round the top of the child's bed, and this descended within some 10 or 12 inches of the pillow on which it lay. They observed that the little creature was quieter whenever they took it up and held it on their laps. They had just replaced him, as he seemed to have grown quite sleepy and tranquil, but he was not 5 minutes in his bed when he began to scream in one of his frenzies of terror, and the same moment the nurse for the first time detected, and Mrs. Prosser equally plainly saw, following the directions of her eyes, the real cause of the child's suffering. Protruding through the aperture of the press, and shrouded in the shade of the valance, they plainly saw the white fat hand, palm downwards, presented towards the head of the child. The mother uttered a scream and snatched the child from its little bed, and she and the nurse ran down to the ladies' sleeping room, where Mr. Prosser was in bed, shutting the door as they entered, and they had hardly done so when a gentle tap came on it from the outside. There is a great deal more, but this will suffice. The singularity of the narrative seems to me to be this, that it describes the ghost of a hand and no more. The person to whom the hand belonged never once appeared, nor was it a hand separated from a body, but only a hand so manifested and introduced that its owner was always, by some crafty accident, hidden from view. In the year 1819, at a college breakfast, I met a Mr. Prosser, a thin, grave, but rather chatty old gentleman, with very white hair drawn back into a pigtail, and he told us all, with a concise particularity, a story of his cousin, James Prosser, who, when an infant, had slept for some time in what his mother said was a haunted nursery in an old house near Chapelizod, and who, whenever he was ill, over-fatigued, or anywise feverish, suffered all through his life as he had done from a time he could scarce remember, from a vision of a certain gentleman, fat and pale, every curl of whose wig, every button and fold of whose laced clothes, and every feature of line of whose sensual, benignant, and unwholesome face, every button and fold of whose laced clothes, and every feature of line of those sensual, benignant, and unwholesome face, was as minutely engraven upon his memory as the dress and lineaments of his own grandfather's portrait, which hung before him every day at breakfast, dinner, and supper. Mr. Prosser mentioned this as an instance of a curiously monotonous, individualized, and persistent nightmare, and hinted the extreme horror and anxiety with which his cousin, of whom he spoke in the past tense as poor Jamie, was at times induced to mention it. I hope the reader will pardon me for loitering so long in the Tilde house, but this sort of lore has always had a charm for me, and people, you know, especially old people, will talk of what most interests themselves, too often forgetting that others may have had more than enough of it. The end. Hope to see you next time. Bye.